That night in October, Olivia fell asleep on my lap for the first time in 2 years. She'd been coming to my porch since she was 21, bringing tea and stories from her mother's bakery while I sanded whatever I was building that week. I'm Jack, I'm 36, and I've lived alone in this house in Greenfield, Virginia since my marriage ended 6 years ago. That night, the air turned cold, and she shifted closer until her head was in my lap. And then her phone lit up with a message I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't know what to do with my hands, and I didn't know that everything between us was about to change. My name is Jack Dalton. I build custom furniture in a one-man shop behind my house in Greenfield, Virginia, and I've been doing it for almost 10 years now. The shop is a converted barn with a concrete floor and a wood stove that smokes when the wind blows from the north. I like the work because it's honest, and wood doesn't pretend because it bows or it holds, and you can tell by running your hand across the grain whether you did it right. Most of my commissions come from people in town who want a dining table or a bookshelf or a bed frame that doesn't wobble when you sit on the edge. I don't advertise, and word gets around in a place like Greenfield. And if you do good work, that's enough to keep the lights on and the stove fed. The porch is where I live when I'm not working. I built it myself the same week I moved out of the bedroom and started sleeping in the room that used to be my office. Karen and I had been married for 4 years, and by the end of it, we were two people sharing a house and nothing else. No fighting, no drama, and just a slow emptying out of everything that had ever been between us. She packed her things on a Tuesday, and I drove in the last screw on the porch railing on a Thursday, and that was that. I never fixed up the bedroom after she left. I just closed the door and built myself a place outside where I could sit and hear the crickets and not think about what went wrong. The porch runs the full width of the house on the east side, facing the hills. It's got an old couch I found at the church yard sale, 2 wooden chairs I made from scrap maple, and a low table that holds whatever I'm drinking or sanding at the time. The railing is cedar, and in the late afternoon, the sun hits it and the whole porch smells like the inside of a cigar box. I sit out there most evenings from the time I shut down the shop until the light goes. Sometimes I eat dinner there. Sometimes I just sit. The quiet doesn't bother me the way it bothers some people. I've had practice with it. Olivia Marsh started coming to the porch in June, 2 summers ago. She'd just moved back to Greenfield after finishing college in Richmond, and her mother had put her to work at the bakery on Main Street. I knew her mother, Diane, from the farmer's market where I used to sell cutting boards on Saturdays. Olivia came by the shop one afternoon to pick up a breadboard her mother had ordered, and she stood in the doorway looking at the shavings on the floor and the half-built table on the workbench, and she said it smelled like her grandfather's workshop. That was the first thing she ever said to me. Not hello, not nice to meet you, just that it smelled like someone she missed. She came back the next evening with a cup of tea and sat on the porch steps while I sanded a chair leg. She didn't ask permission, and I didn't ask her to leave, so she just sat there. And after a while, she kicked off her shoes and set the tea on the railing and started telling me about the woman who'd come into the bakery that morning and ordered a cake shaped like a bass guitar. That was the pattern she set in the first week. Show up with tea, kick off her shoes, tell me something about her day. And I'd listen and sand, and sometimes tell her something back. It was easy in a way that nothing had been easy in a long time. She did it every evening that summer, and then every evening that fall. And by the time the first frost came, the porch had 2 people on it instead of 1, and we never talked about why. She just belonged there. Like the couch and the crickets and the cedar railing, she fit in a way that I couldn't have planned if I'd tried. And I didn't try, because trying would have meant asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. What I didn't know then was that the answers were coming, whether I asked for them or not. I noticed the small things first. The way you notice a crack in a joint before you notice the whole frame is shifting. Olivia touched my arm when she laughed, and she remembered the details of my commissions weeks after I'd mentioned them once. She knew I was building a walnut dining table for the Carters before I'd told anyone else because she'd seen the rough cut in the shop and asked about it. She brought me coffee from the bakery on mornings when she knew I had a deadline, and once she left a bag of her mother's lemon cookies on the workbench with a note that said, "For the guy who works too much." I kept that note in the drawer with the measuring tape for 3 months before I threw it away. I don't know why I kept it that long. There was a night in August, the first summer, when she stayed later than usual. I walked her home because she'd had 2 glasses of wine and the road was dark. When we got to her mother's front porch, she stopped on the top step and turned around and looked at me. And there was a moment where she stood there with her keys in her hand and the porch light on her face. And she didn't move toward the door. She just looked at me. I said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and she went inside, and I walked back home with something stuck in my chest that I couldn't name and didn't want to. I was 34 then, and she was 21, and I told myself that was the whole story. She was young and friendly, and I was the nearest porch, and the things I was starting to feel were just loneliness wearing a different face. I'd been alone for 4 years by then, and loneliness will make you see things that aren't there. That's what I told myself. Every time she leaned into me on the couch, every time she lingered at the door, every time she went quiet when I said something that closed a door she was trying to open, I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading into it because I wanted there to be something to read. The night she wore the blue dress stands out because it was the first time I couldn't look away. She'd been somewhere after work, a birthday dinner for a friend, and she came to the porch still wearing it. The dress was plain, just cotton, the kind of thing you'd wear to a backyard party. But she looked different in it. She looked like someone I shouldn't be sitting next to on an old couch in the dark. I looked up from the chair leg I was sanding, and I went still. And then I looked down at my work because looking at her felt like standing too close to the edge of something. She sat down next to me and pulled the blanket over her legs and asked what I was working on, and I told her, and she talked about the dinner and the friend and the cake that didn't turn out right, and I listened and nodded and didn't say a word about the dress, or the way the porch light caught her collarbone, or the way my hands had gone tight around the sanding block. That was the night I stopped lying to myself about what I was feeling. I didn't stop lying to her, I just stopped pretending inside my own head. There was a difference, and I held on to it like it mattered, even though it didn't. A few weeks later, Mrs. Hadley from the post office saw us coming out of the hardware store together and said, "You two make a nice couple," with that knowing smile small-town women get when they think they've figured you out.
I said, "We're just friends," and I said it fast, the way you say something when you're afraid someone might believe the other thing first. Olivia didn't say anything. She was standing right next to me, and she didn't say a single word. She just picked up the bag of sandpaper I'd bought and walked to the truck, and I followed, and the ride back was quiet. The silence in the cab was different that day, heavier, like something had been put on the table and then pulled back before either of us could touch it. And the thing neither of us knew yet was that the pulling back was about to end, because October was coming, and October doesn't let you pretend. That Thursday in October, the air had turned for real. The maples along the road were burning red, and the mornings had frost on the windshield. I'd lit the wood stove in the shop for the first time that week, and my hands were still cold from planing oak in the chill when Olivia showed up at 6. She had her tea, and she had a flannel shirt over her t-shirt, and she looked tired in a way that made me want to ask her to stay home and rest. Except this was her place too now, and I didn't get to tell her when to come and go. She settled into her corner of the couch and pulled the old quilt over her legs and asked how the table was going. I told her about the walnut dining table, how the grain was fighting me on one of the leaves, and I'd had to steam bend the edge twice before it sat flat. She listened the way she always does, with her whole face, asking questions that showed she'd been paying attention the last time I talked about it. That's the thing about Olivia. She doesn't half listen and wait for her turn to talk. She hears you, and she remembers, and the next time you pick up the thread, she's right there with you. We talked about nothing for a while.
She told me about a customer who wanted a 3-tier wedding cake shaped like a lighthouse, and how her mother had said yes before checking if they even owned a lighthouse-shaped pan. I laughed and she laughed, and the sound of it moved through the porch and into the dark, and I thought, not for the first time, that this was the best part of my day, and it wasn't even close. Then she said her mother had been after her again about the pharmacist's son. His name was Peter, and he was 25, and he'd just moved to Greenfield to work at the Rexall. And according to Diane Marsh, he was polite and employed and had good teeth. Olivia said all of this in a voice that made it clear what she thought of good teeth as a qualification for anything. I said, "He seems fine." And she looked at me and said, "He's fine." And the word hung there between us, like a nail I'd driven halfway and couldn't decide whether to pull out or drive home. She shifted on the couch. She does this thing where she moves closer without making a decision about it, like gravity is doing the work and she's just going along. Her shoulder touched mine, and she pulled the quilt up higher and said something about the cold, and the warmth of her came through the flannel and the shirt underneath, and I didn't move away, because I never move away. Not from her, not even when I should. She asked me if I ever thought about getting married again. She asked it casual, like she was asking about the weather, but her voice dropped half a note on the word again, and I heard it the way you hear a floorboard creak in an empty house. I said, "The porch is enough." I don't know why I said that. It wasn't true. The porch wasn't enough, not anymore. But I wasn't going to sit in the dark with Olivia and admit that the thing I wanted most was the one thing I couldn't have. Not when having it could mean losing her. She went quiet after that, the kind of quiet that isn't comfortable, that sits next to you on the couch and fills the space with everything neither of you is saying. She pulled her knees up under the quilt and stared at the hills, and after a while, she leaned her head against my shoulder. Her hair smelled like the bakery, vanilla and warm bread, and something sweeter underneath that I couldn't name. I sat there with her head on my shoulder and my hands in my lap, and my chest so tight I thought something might crack. She said she was tired. Long day, early shift, too many cakes. I told her to close her eyes for a minute. She said she would, just for a minute. She shifted one more time, and then she settled, and her breathing slowed, and her hand came to rest on my knee like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she'd done it 1,000 times, like she'd been waiting all day to do exactly this. I don't know how long she'd been sleeping when she shifted. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Her head slid from my shoulder to my lap, slow and easy, like a book falling off a table. Her hand moved from my knee to the hem of my shirt and curled into the fabric, and I felt her fingers go still against my stomach. Her breathing was deep and even, the kind of sleep that comes from being truly tired and truly safe. And I sat there on that old couch with her head in my lap and my whole body locked up like I'd swallowed a bolt. I didn't move, barely even breathed. My left hand was resting on the arm of the couch, and my right hand was hanging somewhere above her hair, and I could feel the heat of her scalp against my palm from 2 inches away. And I wanted to let my hand fall. I wanted to rest it on her hair the way you'd rest it on a dog sleeping at your feet, just to feel the warmth of another living thing, just to know it was real. But I didn't. I put my hand back on the arm of the couch, and I held it there, and I looked at the dark hills, and I listened to her breathe, and I thought about how this was the closest I'd been to another person in 6 years, and how I was going to pay for it later when I was alone in the house with nothing but the memory of it. Her face was turned toward me in the porch light. Her lips were parted, and her lashes were dark against her cheeks, and she looked young, younger than 23, and I felt something twist in my chest that was part tenderness and part shame, because I was sitting here studying her face while she slept, and I was old enough to know better and too gone to stop. I told myself I was just watching over her the way a friend would, the way you'd watch over anyone who fell asleep on your couch. But I knew that wasn't true. I knew what I was doing. I was memorizing her because I didn't think I'd ever get this close again. The phone buzzed on the cushion beside her hip. The screen lit up white in the dark, and I looked at it the way you look at anything that moves in the dark. Just a reflex, nothing deliberate. The notification bar showed a message from a contact named Emily, and under the name were 2 lines of text that the phone let show before the screen went dark again. I read them before I could decide not to. If I tell him the truth, he'll never look at me the same. The screen went black. I sat there while the crickets kept going, and Olivia's fingers stayed curled in my shirt. My heart had climbed into my throat, and my hand was on the arm of the couch where I'd put it, and I stared at the dark screen of her phone, and I tried to breathe, and I couldn't, because the words were still there in the air in front of me, like paint on a wall. The phone buzzed again, and the screen lit up with another message from Emily. This one said, "You can't keep hiding it forever, Liv." And then the screen went dark again, and the porch was just the porch again. The couch and the quilt and the hills and the crickets and the woman with her head in my lap, and the whole world cracked down the middle like a board you didn't check for knots before you ran it through the saw. I didn't pick up the phone because I didn't need to, since I already knew what the truth was. I'd known it, somewhere underneath all the things I told myself, since the night she stood on her mother's porch and didn't go inside. Since the day she went quiet when I said, "Just friends." Since the evening she showed up in the blue dress, and I couldn't look away, and I couldn't look at her either. The truth was that Olivia Marsh was in love with me, and she'd been in love with me for a long time, and she was terrified that I'd find out because she thought it would break the only thing she had with me. And I sat there with her head in my lap and her phone dark on the cushion and my hand white-knuckled on the arm of the couch, and I thought, she's wrong about one thing. The truth didn't make me look at her different. It made me look at her the way I'd been trying not to for 2 years. I don't know how long I sat there, whether it was 20 minutes or an hour. Time does something different on the porch at night when you're sitting next to a truth you weren't ready for. The crickets kept their rhythm, and the wind moved through the cedars, and Olivia slept with her hand in my shirt, and I sat there going through every moment I'd dismissed or explained away or refused to see, and all of it lined up like joints in a well-built frame, every piece fitting where it was supposed to. And I couldn't believe I'd spent 2 years calling it something else. Every time she touched my arm when she laughed, she was reaching for me. Every time she remembered a detail about my work, she was paying attention the way you pay attention to someone you love, not the way you pay attention to a neighbor. The night she stood on the porch and didn't go inside, she was waiting for me to say something. The day she went quiet at Just Friends, she was swallowing the thing she wanted to say. The blue dress, the question about marriage, the way she said, "He's fine," like the word tasted sour. All of it was her, standing on the edge of the same thing I'd been standing on the edge of, and we'd both been too afraid to jump. But then the fear came back, because the fear always comes back. She's 23 years old. She's just starting her life. She's got her whole future ahead of her, And I'm a 36-year-old furniture maker with a failed marriage and a one-man shop and a porch I built because I couldn't sleep in my own bedroom. What do I have to offer someone like Olivia? A couch with a sag in the middle and a truck with 200,000 miles on it and hands that are rough from sandpaper and saw blades. That's not enough. That's not even close to enough for a woman who could have anyone her own age. Someone who'd take her to restaurants and concerts and cities she's never seen. Someone who wouldn't make her explain to her friends why she's with a man 13 years older. And then, underneath that, the part that undid me. She knew all of it. She'd seen the shop and the truck and the quiet life and the scar on my left knuckle where the table saw caught me my first year. And she came to the porch anyway. She saw the empty house and the drawer with the ring I never threw away, and the fact that I don't go into town much anymore. And she still chose to spend her evenings here. She still fell asleep on my lap. She still curled her fingers into my shirt like she was holding on to something she was afraid would pull away. The fear she described in that message to Emily, "He'll never look at me the same," that was my fear too. That's what hit me hardest. We'd been carrying the same fear from opposite sides of the same room. She was afraid that telling me would change the way I saw her, and I was afraid that admitting how I felt would change the way she saw me. And both of us were so busy protecting the friendship that we were letting the thing we actually wanted die on the vine. Olivia stirred. Her fingers tightened in my shirt and then relaxed, and her head turned on my lap so her face was toward the quilt, and I had just enough time to lift my hand from the arm of the couch before she settled again. I wasn't ready. I didn't know what to say to her if she woke up. I didn't know if I should tell her what I'd seen or if I should bury it and pretend my heart wasn't cracking open on the porch while the crickets sang and the October air went cold. I moved slow, the way you move around something sleeping that you're afraid to wake. I lifted her head with both hands, gentle, and slid my leg out from under her, and lowered her cheek onto the pillow from the other end of the couch. I pulled the quilt up over her shoulders, and I stood up, and I walked to the railing, and I put my hands flat on the cedar, and I breathed the cold air, and I tried to figure out who I was now that I knew. I drove her home at 11. She woke up groggy on the ride and said she couldn't believe she fell asleep on me, and she laughed a little, and I said it was fine, and I kept my eyes on the road and my hands on the wheel, and nothing was said about the phone, because she didn't know I'd seen it, and I wasn't ready to tell her. The next few days were the longest I've spent on that porch since the summer I built it. I tried to act normal. I went to the shop, I planed boards, I sanded edges. I finished the walnut table and loaded it into the truck for delivery. And every evening, I went back to the porch and waited for Olivia, and told myself I could do this. I could sit next to her and not say the thing that was burning a hole in my chest. She came the next evening, like always, tea in hand, shoes off, and she sat in her corner of the couch and started telling me about the lighthouse cake disaster. And I listened and nodded and tried to pay attention, but I couldn't stop seeing the message every time I looked at her. If I tell him the truth, he'll never look at me the same. The words were burned into my head, and I couldn't unsee them, and I couldn't look at Olivia the way I'd looked at her before, because before I'd been pretending, and now I wasn't. And the pretending had been the only thing that made sitting next to her bearable. I watched her differently now. I caught the things I'd missed, or chosen to miss. The way her eyes followed me when I got up to refill my cup. The way she leaned into my shoulder before she had a reason to. The way her voice went soft on certain words, like my name, like the word home, like she was pressing meaning into them that she hoped I'd hear. And the way her hand brushed mine on the railing when we stood looking at the hills, and how she didn't pull back right away, how her fingers stayed near mine for a beat too long, like she was waiting for me to close the gap. I started pulling back without deciding to. It wasn't something I planned. It was more like a reflex, the way you pull your hand off a stove before you know you're burned. I sat a little further down the couch. I didn't let the silences stretch the way they used to, the comfortable silences where we'd sit side by side and listen to the crickets and not need words. I filled those silences with talk about commissions and weather and the delivery schedule. And the talk came out stiff and unnatural, like furniture built from a kit instead of from scratch. Olivia noticed. She's too sharp not to notice. The third evening, she asked me if something was wrong. I said I was just tired. A lot of work, the holidays coming up. She looked at me for a long time after I said it, the way she looks at a joint that doesn't quite sit flush. And then she nodded and let it go. But I could see she wasn't satisfied with the answer, and she was giving me space to come up with a better one. The near miss happened on the fourth night. We were standing at the railing, looking at the hills in the last of the light, and she reached over and put her hand on mine.
It was simple and natural, the kind of thing a friend might do, the sort of gesture she'd made a dozen times before. But this time, I moved my hand. I picked it up and wrapped it around my coffee cup, and I didn't look at her when I did it. I felt her pull back like she'd touched a stove. She didn't say anything, just finished her tea and said she should go, and I said, "Drive safe," and she walked down the steps and got in her car, and I stood on the porch and listened to the engine fade, and I wanted to drive my fist through the cedar railing I'd built with my own hands. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the office that used to be my bedroom before I gated up, and I stared at the ceiling, and I went over it again and again, the way you go over a cut you made wrong, trying to figure out where you went off the line. She'd reached for me, and I'd pulled away. Not because I didn't want her to touch me, because I wanted it too much. Because I was sitting on top of a secret that she didn't know I knew. And every time she got close, it felt like the secret was going to come pouring out of me, and I wasn't ready for what would happen after. But what I didn't understand yet was that the not ready was already doing damage, and the damage was about to walk through my door. 3 days passed, and Olivia didn't come to the porch. The first day, I told myself she was busy. The second day, I walked past the bakery on Main Street on my way to the hardware store, and I saw her through the window, frosting a cake, and she looked up and saw me, and I raised my hand, and she raised hers, and neither of us smiled. The third day, the porch had that wrong feeling. The feeling of a place that's missing a piece, like a house with a window gone. I built a set of shelves for a client, and every board I cut came out slightly off, and I couldn't make my hands steady enough to fix it. The shop felt wrong without her voice in it, and the porch felt like a room with the windows boarded up. And by the third night, I started to understand what it would actually mean if she stopped coming. On the fourth evening, just as the light was going, she showed up. I was sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and I heard her steps on the gravel, and my heart did something it hadn't done since I was 20, and didn't know yet what a heart could do to you when it wanted something it couldn't have. She walked up the steps and sat down on the far end of the couch, and it was the first time in 2 years she'd sat anywhere but her corner next to me. She was different. Quieter, but not the comfortable kind of quiet. This was the quiet of someone who's been turning something over in their mind for days and has finally decided to say it. Her jaw was set, and her hands were in the pockets of her jacket, and she looked at the hills instead of at me, and the distance between us felt on that couch like a cold draft through a gap in the framing. She said, "Did I do something wrong?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My throat was closed, the way it closes when you're standing on a roof and you look down and your body won't let you step to the edge. She turned and looked at me, and her eyes were hard and hurt at the same time, and she said, "You're acting like I'm someone you don't want to be around, Jack, and I need to know why." I said, "You didn't do anything wrong," which was the truth and which was also a lie. Because the truth was that she'd done everything right, and I was the one who was falling apart. She shook her head. "Something changed. That night I fell asleep. Something changed, and you won't tell me what it is." She was right, and I couldn't say it, and the not saying was a wall I was building between us, brick by brick, and I could feel her on the other side of it, and I couldn't make myself reach over. She stood up. She pulled her jacket tight and she said, "I'm not going to keep coming to a porch where I'm not wanted." Her voice cracked on the word wanted, and she caught it and swallowed it, and her face went flat and hard, and I knew that face because it's the face you make when you're trying not to cry in front of someone who's making you cry. She walked to the steps, and I said her name. She stopped, but she didn't turn around. The porch light was on her hair, and her shoulders were up around her ears, and she looked small standing there at the top of the steps, smaller than she'd ever looked. And I wanted to get up and go to her, and I wanted to tell her everything, and instead I said, "You are wanted." And I almost said more. I almost told her about the phone and the message and the 2 years of pretending and the night I sat on this couch with her head in my lap and my whole chest cracking open. But the words died in my throat because what if I was wrong? What if the message meant something else? What if I told her and she looked at me the way Karen used to look at me, like I was a problem she'd already solved? The screen door slapped shut behind her. I heard her car start and the headlights sweep across the yard and the engine fade down the road. And I sat on the couch where she'd sat next to me 1,000 evenings, and I put my head in my hands, and I stayed like that until the cold drove me inside. And the whole time I was sitting there, I kept thinking the same thing. The same thought on a loop like a saw blade spinning. I had one more chance to get this right, and I'd already wasted 2 years of chances, and if I didn't walk through that door tomorrow and tell the truth, I was going to spend the rest of my life on a porch built for 2 with only 1 cup of tea on the table. I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch all night with a blanket over my shoulders and a cup of coffee that went cold and then warm again when I refilled it at 3 in the morning. And I listened to the night sounds. And I thought about the things a man loses when he lets fear do his thinking for him. I'd lost Karen to silence, to the slow habit of not saying what was true until the truth didn't matter anymore. And now I was losing Olivia the same way. And I swore to myself, sitting on that porch in the dark, that I wasn't going to let fear take this one too. The next evening, I was on the porch at 5. I'd showered and shaved and put on a clean shirt, which was more than I'd done for anyone in 2 years, and I sat on the couch and waited. The light went golden, and then orange, and then purple, and she never showed. I waited another hour. The crickets started, and the first star came out, and the porch went dark, and she didn't come. I drove to the bakery. It was closed, the chairs up on the tables and the lights off,
and I sat in the truck for a minute with my hands on the wheel, and then I drove to Diane's house on Picket Lane. Emily answered the door. She's Olivia's older sister, 27, with the same dark hair and a harder edge to her jaw. And she looked at me standing on the porch in my clean shirt, and she didn't say hello. She said, "She's in the back. You should go talk to her." And I knew then that Emily was the one who'd sent the messages. And I knew she'd been waiting for me to show up. And I walked through the house and out the back door and into the yard. Olivia was sitting on a bench by the garden, wrapped in a sweater, staring at the tomato plants that were done for the season. She saw me, and her face closed, the way a door closes when someone doesn't want you to see what's inside. I sat down beside her on the bench. She didn't move away, but she didn't look at me either. I said, "The other night, when you fell asleep on the porch, your phone lit up." I paused. I could feel my pulse in my throat when I added, "I saw a message from Emily. I saw what it said." Olivia went rigid. I've seen wood go rigid under a clamp when you're bending it to shape, the whole piece locking up like it's fighting you. And that's what she did. Her whole body went still, and her hands gripped the edge of the bench, and she didn't breathe. And I could see her throat working like she was trying to swallow something that wouldn't go down. I said, "You said if you told me the truth, I'd never look at you the same." I let that sit for a second, let it land, let her feel the weight of it. Then I said, "You were right." She started to pull away. Her shoulders came up and her head turned, and I could see the hurt coming into her face like water rising. And I said, "Let me finish." She stopped. I said, "I don't look at you the same, because now I know, and I can't pretend anymore either." I told her everything. I confessed to the 2 years of sitting next to her on that couch and telling myself she was just a friend. I told her about the blue dress and the walk home, and the night she asked about marriage, and I said the porch was enough, and how that was the biggest lie I'd ever told, because the porch was never enough. Not since the first evening she kicked off her shoes and sat on the steps and told me the bakery smelled like her grandfather's shop. I told her about the fear I'd carried, the age gap, the failed marriage, the old truck and the rough hands and the quiet house, and all the reasons I'd given myself for why I couldn't have her, and how every single one of those reasons was just another word for coward. I said, "I've been in love with you since before I knew what to call it, and I've been too afraid to say it because I thought saying it would mean losing you." I said, "I was wrong. Not saying it is what's losing you." Olivia's eyes were wet. She blinked twice, and the tears came, and she wiped them with the back of her hand, and she looked at me for the first time since I'd sat down. She said, "I've been in love with you since the first summer on the porch." Her voice came out raw and low and cracked on the word first, and she kept going. "I was afraid to say it because I thought you'd tell me I was too young to know what that means." I said, "You're not too young to know." I reached over and I took her hand. She held on, and her fingers were cold and tight, and they didn't let go. We sat there on the bench by the dead tomato plants and the last of the October light going gold over the hills, and the garden was quiet, and the porch light was on at her mother's house, and somewhere a dog was barking. And none of it mattered, because she was holding my hand and I was holding hers, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything I'd been afraid to want for 2 years, compressed into the space between our fingers. I spent 2 years afraid of losing her, and it took a phone screen in the dark to show me I was already losing her by saying nothing. The porch is the same. The couch sags in the middle, and the crickets come out at dusk, and the cedar railing still smells like a cigar box when the sun hits it. But now, there are 2 cups of tea on the table instead of 1, and I don't sit there wondering anymore. If you want the next story, subscribe. There's always another porch.